Wait a minute.
What's up?
Are you recording this, Ben?
Nope.
Okay.
And we're recording.
Awesome, thank you. Welcome everyone again to the Clarifying on Kubernetes Working Group Forum for the start of the new year, January 11th, 2022. Looks like we have a couple topics on the document. I will link it again in chat so you can get to it that way. If you have anything that you want added to the document, feel free to drop it in the chat and I can add it in as well. But the first topic we have is the proposal for user-provided service instance support. Tim, you want to give us the TLDR?
Yeah, so not expecting everybody to just jump in and start reading this. Just wanted to share out that some folks on the team have done an exploration into how we might support user-provided service instances, which, as you may or may not know, in CF are a way of manually configuring a service instance that you can bind your app to. So like no service broker API or anything, just like manually providing some credentials and configuration that you can use for service bindings. So the TLDR of this proposal is to leverage some projects like the Kubernetes service binding spec and some of their resource, they call them duck types, such as the provisioned service duck type, and use that to build out some initial support for these user provided service instances. So anyways, we're open to feedback, and we'd appreciate it if like everyone could like take a look and comment on this proposal.
Awesome, sounds interesting. I personally have not been able to look at it yet, but we'll definitely do so because this sounds pretty cool. Any questions or comments people have? Maybe things that they want to ask Tim since he's here? No? All right. Well, we'll probably I'll have to take a look at that since it'll take a little bit of time. So the next item I see is about prefixing GUIDs and namespaces and statefulsets, and it says should we create CFOrg and CFSpace CRs first?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is the best forum for this question, but we had a spike to try to prefix the GUIDs that we use for the names of Kubernetes namespaces and stateful sets with some prefixes that would allow people to kind of identify them. And I think this was probably mostly to do with namespaces, because it's kind of hard to tell when you're using the Kubernetes client what's what. You just see this sea of GUIDs. So there was apparently feedback from users, customers, that like, geez, it would be nice if we had some clue whether these things are orgs or spaces. So the first thing we tried to do was just, when we generate the GUID, we just added a little bit of goo at the front of the GUID to make it into, you know, CFOrg blah, or CFSpace blah. The problem with that approach is that then comes back through the API as the GUIDs that we use for orgs and spaces. So if we want those GUIDs to look sort of traditionally like a GUID, then we needed to, everywhere we were interfacing between the internal representation and the CF API, we had to strip those things out and then re-inject them on the way back in, which seemed like it was brittle and terrible. So we were thinking, well, we need to, if that's an actual requirement, then we need to move the implementation down into the controller layer, preferably. But as it stands right now, we don't have controllers for orgs and spaces. We've been talking about maybe we ought to, maybe it makes sense to wait on this until we do, so that we could then have a CFOrg with a name that just looks like a GUID, and then handle in that controller, handle the internal representation by prefixing it on its way in and out. So we thought we'd see. I think one of the big questions for this is like, how hard is the requirement that we have GUIDs that look like GUIDs in the CF API? Because a GUID isn't like a prescribed format. It has to be globally unique.
As a user of these GUIDs, I actually prefer just having the prefix in front and just knowing the convention. Let's say a convention of prefix underscore GUID. If you use that type of convention, then I always know how to strip it off and get to the actual GUID if I actually need the GUID. But if you use internally the prefix underscore GUID for everything that you're doing, then I don't need to worry about stripping it off. Just use it, send it through. And I don't think it's any confusion that anybody, you don't have to call it GUID, you call it a unique ID, right? You don't have to call it. GUID has a special meaning, right? How it gets formed. But in this case, you're adding a prefix onto it, call it by some other name, and now that's used throughout the whole interface. The only thing that has to change is if you have any databases that are restricted to saying this is a GUID type, right? You want to change that to be a string of whatever, right? So I would, if you're looking down the approach of trying to be traditional versus just practical, I would go down the practical route more than the traditional route. And people won't be confused by it. GitHub, for example, does that for its personal access tokens, for example, and other tokens. It's a GUID, but it's a prefix in front of it.
That's some great feedback. Thank you. I think as long as we can get away with that and there isn't some hard requirement somewhere that we haven't sussed out yet, then that sounds like a pretty good thought to just optimize for practicality.
So we are just talking about prefixing with org or space, are we? Not with the actual name of the org or space.
Well, it would end up on the namespace. It would be the name of the namespace. Like the requirement, as I understood it, was the name of the namespace should have a CFOrg or CFSpace on it, so that it's easier to understand what that namespace is.
Yeah, I mean, if this escalates into saying when I create org foo, I want it to say CFOrg foo and then a GUID, then there's trouble because then we've got this whole problem with
yes, no,
immutability of names. Yeah, okay.
It's not the name, the Cloud Foundry name. It's the Cloud Foundry GUID / Kubernetes name.
It's the internal naming. It's the internal names, not the external names. From that standpoint, right? The user interface doesn't change. You don't. Most users don't look at these GUIDs. It's only people who are using the API internally and stuff like that they'll have to worry about it directly. Otherwise, no users would be affected by it. They wouldn't even know it.
Yeah, and going back, like Kieran's concern is if we put the like CF name, those are mutable, and on Kubernetes, like the name fields, like once you change that, it's no longer the same resource. So we're just talking about like static, well-known prefixes for each type.
If the purpose is to make these things more recognizable to kubectl users, let's say, can we solve this with labels, for example? Because I guess it's less visible because you have to look at the resource to see which label it has, instead of like in a list, it wouldn't be immediately visible. But
Again, using the practicality approach, when I'm trying to use the API and walk down the tree of GUIDs in order to get from the org to the space to the apps, whatever, they'll all have their prefixes, and I'm just going to look at the GUID that comes back, and it helps me when I'm looking at that data. Okay, I'm looking at the apps GUID here. Right now, I have to base it upon looking at the URL string of where the GUID is located within the string, kind of knowing what's going on by having that in it. It makes it a little easier that I know what type of GUID that corresponds to by having something in front of it versus just having a traditional straight 64 character GUID in front of me. Again, I'm going back to practical versus traditional.
Yeah, my suspicion is this is coming from somebody who's a Kubernetes operator who has a cluster with a bunch of other stuff on it, with a bunch of other namespaces, and it's kind of hard for them to tell which ones are the ones that we polluted their cluster with. And so we could come up with a bunch of different ways to solve it, but probably the least obscure would be the best. Like, we could put a label on, but then they have to know to look for a particular label.
yeah, and if I remember correctly, it was also get the hierarchical namespace thing to propagate labels through to the actual namespaces. So maybe just picking up a name is just easier.
Yeah, that particular approach is like 3 lines of code, or 6 if we want to extract constants. So it's pretty simple.
Yeah. So I guess the following question would be, if we do want to do something like CFSpace, either dash or underscore the GUID, and same with the org, if that pattern seems like something that's good to us, would we want to propagate that to all the other resource types? Or is it only something we find is needed for sort of the org space?
I mean, it's something that when Julie and I were talking about this yesterday, we were looking at just the non-CF resources because that's the ones that we felt were the most confusing. But based on Norm's comment, it might be worth just doing across the board and saying, okay, yeah, everything has this prefix. So that way, you know what you're looking at without having to think about, okay, what type is this, and looking at other values.
It also makes it a little easier for testing purposes. If you put the wrong GUID in place, you can't tell that by just looking at a traditional GUID, but if you put that prefix in front and you expect it to be a user-provided service GUID versus a marketplace GUID, what if there's a difference, right? You could have that prefix being different, you can see it right away, and you can test for it, and you have better test cases.
I mean, it would be quite redundant to have a CF app resource with the name CF app blah. So that's something that I wouldn't like to see, honestly. Like for any resource we reconcile to, so I don't know, deployments, Like knowing that a deployment was produced by a CF app is useful. So calling the deployment CF app something, I think makes sense. But calling the CF app object resource CF app something feels very redundant. And same for namespaces, which are again target resources, or I don't know, whichever. We probably generate a whole bunch of other resources that are not around custom CRDs. Like our custom CRDs reconcile to a whole bunch of things. So we could use that approach for those destination resources. I wouldn't use them for the source resources, if you see what I mean. Like we're talking about, for example, CFOrg and CFSpace CRDs. Using like prefixing the name of those resources wouldn't make much sense to me. Like, but the namespace they reconcile to, or even the HNS resources that they reconcile to, then yes, that makes sense. Because then you know where they come from. The problem is kind of tracing back where they come from. But like the CF app doesn't come from anywhere. It's our entry point. Right? So I don't think it makes sense to prefix those, especially if we expect those resources to be created by users directly one day potentially. I don't want to ask people to prefix stuff like that. Doesn't sound like a good UX.
Again, it's not the user that's doing the prefixing, it's the internal subsystem that's doing it. And again, I'm correct me if I'm wrong, Julian, this is all for internal naming conventions and keeping stuff straight. So when somebody's looking at the API data or the internal databases and stuff, they have an idea what they're looking at right off the bat.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the definition of internal versus external. I think we do have the shim, which is at the moment, I think, our outermost layer, but we've also always talked about having a layer of CRDs that is effectively a user interface that people can use instead of this shim.
Okay.
Especially one day replacing the shim altogether, like, I don't know, in a very distant future. So I think we should treat that external layer of CRDs as public interface. Like someone should be able to create those objects by themselves. The API at the moment creates them for you, but like I think we are converging to a point where like we have one CRD per REST resource in the API, and like having a close resemblance, so that one day people could use the CRDs directly instead of hitting the API. So I would be mindful of the experience of creating those objects manually, because
and I think that was
because they could end up being a public interface.
If you look at some Kubernetes objects like pods that sometimes get created by deployments and the naming that they have chosen, I guess they do something like if a deployment creates a pod and it's called my deployment, you get like my deployment dash random string. So they embed the name rather than the type. So maybe we can think of something like that. Maybe, I don't know how applicable is this for orgs and spaces, obviously. But for apps, for example, it wouldn't be nice, as Giuseppe said, it would be redundant to call the app CF app dash my app. It could be more like calling it my app dash UID, so that's unique. But yeah, just wanted to make the parallel to, like, we should probably be looking at what Kubernetes is doing already, because it will feel more native if we follow their patterns. But orgs and spaces are kind of a different beast, I think.
Yeah, well, I guess they don't have to be. If we had a CFOrg and a CFSpace CRD, then it would be.
Yeah.
Then I think you would have the same parallel, because you could just call the org by the raw GUID and the underlying subnamespace anchor by the prefixed GUID. The only problem there is that, of course, the namespace name leaks out, right? You use that everywhere through all the layers of our code. So there will be some changes. But.
Yeah, definitely some good discussion here. On my side, I'm gonna probably need to do some thinking to sort it out and map it out. But that's a lot of good thoughts here.
Yeah, we all know naming is hard.
This is true. Happy to let this conversation continue going for a bit, but we do have a couple other items we want to squeeze in at some point in the next 10 minutes or so. So final thoughts on this until later. Cool. All right. So we have another item that is, should we get rid of the authEnabled feature flag?
Yeah, so some context. We started implementing the shim, and the shim was at the beginning. The shim was always hitting Kubernetes with what we call a privileged client. So this client was using like a system service account to hit Kubernetes, so I had privileges to do everything, right? And then we started actually changing the API so that the user sends a header to the API with their authentication information, and that's used to create a user-scoped Kubernetes client that we then use to hit Kubernetes, so that every operation that hits Kubernetes, even if it's through the shim, it's authenticated as the original user, and we leverage Kubernetes RBAC for our authorization, which is pretty cool. And we're still in the process of doing this, and we're doing it endpoint by endpoint. And our initial impression is that if we just started doing this endpoint by endpoint, then we would get in weird situations when like some endpoints are authenticated and some endpoints are not. So we introduced this feature flag called authEnabled. If you turn it on, then we do what I've just said. Otherwise, we just always use this privileged client, just like we used to do. But today, having a chat with Kieran, we kind of realized that maybe the feature flag is not needed, and there is never a case where doing even like using mixed endpoints, some authenticated, some not, might lead to problems. So the question is, can anyone think on the spot of some situation where like that could be problematic? Because if not, I am very keen to just get rid of the feature flag as soon as possible, and because it's just extra complexity that is sitting there. I couldn't think of anything. So like, it's just, you know, sometimes some things will happen as admin, some things will happen as yourself.
Yeah, so I guess the only thing that flag buys us is an escape valve for when there's bugs and you can't test the thing you're doing because you can't set up your cluster. And
yeah,
so the example I would point to is there's a bug sitting in the backlog about interacting with empty orgs. And I'm not sure if it's all types of clusters, but certainly it comes up with kind. So like if you just create an org and you haven't made a space in it yet, then that org is unfetchable with authEnabled turned on now, or at least it was as of last week. So that makes it very hard to test other features. But having said that, I'm 100% on board with getting rid of this as a goal.
Yeah,
Right, like
initially the idea was like we authenticate all endpoints and then take it off. But if it's not needed, we can take it off immediately. Or I'm wondering if there is any like problems that you've described can be solved just by logging in as an admin, basically. So it's like, okay.
I think that's the case. I always find I have to go and give a, well, we don't have an admin role at the moment, but a space developer role in the CF namespace to the Kubernetes admin user as the first thing when I create a cluster and deploy the API. And then as you create an org, that space developer role gets copied into it, and then all the logic works. There's filtering on orgs that makes sure you've got at least got a binding in it. So that's probably why you can't list it and you can't see it. We're missing that whole step, like you get in normal CF where the admin user is created with an admin role. So if you manually do that, it works at the moment. And I think we need a story to sort that out so that when you get a fresh deployment, there is an admin that works and you kick off from there and everything else fits into place.
Okay, that's Interesting. I'll have to try that.
So-
Yeah, it'd be
so-
great to have that documented or.
So that means that that proper way of getting rid of the future flag is allowing people to kind of set up an admin user when they install the cluster. So when they install the cluster, they say, this is the admin, and we set up the binding for them. And even if the admin role is empty for now, at least our code just checks you have some binding in it. So the role probably doesn't even, I probably can just be a space developer one, like, or like can just be a copy and paste. Like it, or it can be like a very permissive role or whatever. Like we can improve the actual permissions of the admin role later, but like just having a role and a binding kind of solves all these issues.
Yeah.
So maybe we need to think of something, and maybe that's part of our provisioning.
I've just hit this
code.
now in the end-to-end tests. As we start putting auth onto orgs and apps and things like that, where's the thing that can create them to set them up in the E2E? I'm missing an admin user and missing the admin role. So I think we need to go and push this along while we add all these other things.
Mm-hmm. You need some sort of story to introduce the admin role, even if at the moment is not perfect, like just something that can do everything. And
Right.
then
It can be empty to start off with, and we can just add permissions to it as we need them.
exactly, because otherwise you try to do things and you won't be able to do anything. Like if it's at least as powerful as space developer, then it will work for now. I think. No, you need to be able to create orgs. So no. But yeah, whatever. We can think about it, but we need the role, and then we need a way to when you provision to say this is the admin user, and we need a way to automatically set up the binding to that user. Something that eventually we'll have to do. Right? When you install CF, you get an admin user. It's just in our case, we want an existing user of the Kubernetes cluster to be nominated the admin. So we can't just create the user. We need to ask whoever installs to tell us who's the admin, basically.
Yeah, and it's also a bit tricky where to put that logic. So we've got the config package with some YAML files in it. I remember trying to create a CF namespace in there, but it was impossible because Customize was changing namespace names, prefixing everything was CF system and all that lot. So I think now in the deployed dependencies script, it goes and creates the CF root namespace. So that's later on. And it's only once you've created that namespace can you go and create the admin role binding in that namespace. So it feels a bit messy at the moment.
Yeah, but it needs to be something that we distribute. Like it's not just for us. It's like the users the operators who install this thing need to be able to do this.
So it should be in the sort of config area, I think, if it's possible.
Okay. Well, at least we can put some thought into it.
Yep, that makes sense. I just jotted a few notes down there about the discussion about privileges, starting with minimum or sort of opening the gates because it's an admin. Definitely should think around that, but it can probably be driven out of the normal flows. We have a couple minutes left and one item left, which is an update on timeline for public roadmap and beta release. Does anyone with authority here want to speak about the public roadmap? Since we did have the sort of public beta release on Friday. But as far as roadmap, I don't think I'm authoritative.
I think you're talking about me to some degree.
I mean, not to put anyone on the spot here, but I guess generally speaking, and I think Chris is on the call and he'll agree with me, this whole CF on K8s effort is kind of our biggest story for the year. So one of the things that we're really looking forward to is to try and get folks to sort of start engaging with the project, at least by consuming it and just putting it out there in the hands of the people and get some feedback and get some buzz going in general. And I guess the two big things that we are looking for is the beta release tag, I guess. Doesn't matter what it has, what it doesn't have, but just as a milestone, give people the feel that the project is moving forward and we have something to show and tell. And also the whole notion of the public roadmap is kind of very welcoming, so that we have the opportunity to again showcase what people can expect in terms of engineering effort, and how our ideas and theories from the end of last year are actually translating into something actionable for the community to consume largely. So I think that's really the background in terms of introducing that item for discussion here today.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So I mean, I would say for right now, like, we definitely have plans to do betas, right, and release those in the open source side. I think we need to really kind of nail down exactly what we want that one to look like, where we're at a good spot to kind of draw that line and say publicly, like, this is, it's a usable beta, it's a place to be. I don't know that we have a good handle on that exactly just yet, but it's definitely on top of our mind. So I think we'll take that feedback and maybe prioritize that work to make it more public and make it more official. So it's a good call out.
Cool. Yeah, I think all of what Phil said, and we just want to make sure that we have something that is friendly to use rather than frustrating. So that's kind of the high water mark, is we got to make sure it works sort of out of the box. But with that said, we are at time and a minute over, I believe. Or do we actually have the full hour? No, we have a full hour. I forgot. We did half an hour for the past several ones, so I was trying to keep it to 30 minutes. So my apologies for compressing that time. But we can continue talking about topics that people have interest on, or we can adhere to that accidental constrained half hour that I did. How are people feeling one way or another?
I think the only thing I want to just check in real quick, and I don't know, Julian, if you feel otherwise. We talked a lot about the org and the space CRs. I don't know that we really got like what our next steps are on that. Like, is it to put together a couple of options and the pros and the cons? I think we just kind of had a good discussion, but I don't know if there's like what's next. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I feel like we're missing representation from the product org. Also, we're missing the person who fielded the original complaint. So it seemed like the discussion sort of mapped closely to my interior monologue while I was spiking on this. Like, here's, this is the cheap and cheerful way of doing it, which would be maybe not too bad, maybe fine, but maybe also kind of gross. And then there's this other thing, and then there's the right way to do it. And so, yeah, I agree. We don't really have a resolution there, but I think it would be good to get maybe a closer read on the requirements from Eric.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good call. Is to get more definitive, unless Tim, specifically, like more definitively, like what the desired outcome of this is.
I mean, I think from Eric's perspective, the desired outcome is mostly kubectl users or people who have installed like GUIs and stuff on their cluster, just to be able to see like what all these random non-CF resources are, which we talked about a bit. But like, I think a good next step would be to just put together like a, not too heavy, but some doc that like outlines like the different classes of resources, like ones we don't own, ones we do, and anything in between, and how we might name them differently. And just so we can visualize this better and comment on it. Yeah, and then I think there's a second point about like internal representation versus external, like through the shim. If we want to change that, like, because I could imagine there's a world where internally we name these things more friendly, but the shim continues to present them as GUIDs for like databases or clients that rely on that. Or there's a world where we decide that use case is like pretty niche and not that important. So like it would be good to just like dig into that with a little more intentionality, I guess. But I don't know. That's just like the next steps I see. And then like we could get Eric's opinion on that probably easier.
Sure. Yeah, I guess at some point, but part of the question around this is like, how much do we want to invest in it? My fear is that like, if we don't actually care that much about it, we might end up investing quite a lot more in it than we intended to, just to figure out that we don't think it's worth a lot of investment. So that's kind of part of the read I wanted to get from Eric.
Yeah, that's fair.
To do, before spending the time it takes to kind of write, make a total roster of all of the resources that would be touched and which ones would be touched under what scenario and how much work it would be.
I guess I was thinking lighter than that, just like classes of resources, like ones, like literally just ones we don't own, like namespaces and stuff. And then we would just say, like, we attach a prefix, like nothing that like enumerates every single resource or anything and how we might treat it. I just think like there's like a cheaper world where we only touch those and leave the CF ones alone for like the concerns that folks raise around like redundancy and stuff, and like maybe there's less value of renaming those, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, kind of. I'm not sure that I my read on this is that there's really kind of two avenues. One, we just generate some GUIDs with some extra stuff on them. That's incredibly cheap, has some weird side effects. Maybe we care about those side effects, maybe we don't. But we're really talking about 3 objects, right? And then there's the, we're gonna go do it the right way approach, where we find the boundary between the things that we own and the things we don't own, and we inject prefixes at the point where we hand it off to, for example, the Arena LRP from the CF process, or the subnamespace anchor from whatever layer is creating the subnamespace anchor. And that second approach is a bit more expensive. It requires us to be more careful. Has some aspects where it leaks, right? Like even if we're really trying to sanitize it, we still have Kubernetes namespaces referred to everywhere. So we have to be aware that those things have a prefix now. So there's more work, right? And maybe we want to wait until we've implemented orgs and spaces in order to make it cleaner. But without knowing like, oh, what's the urgency around this? It's a little hard to make that call. So yeah, I was kind of hoping that Eric would be in this meeting, but we can bring it up again in Team Forum. Maybe that's the next step.
Cool. Yeah, it all makes sense. I think for my thoughts, part of what we're running into is, as mentioned, that divide between the custom resources and Kubernetes resources. And if we really wanted to just overkill it, we could make a custom resource that wraps each Kubernetes resource, but that's just a whole bunch of mechanics we don't want to deal with. So this prefix is probably, if we divide it between those, that probably works. So
I'm like, I think some of the feedback was like, people care a lot about namespaces and they care a lot about pods because they want to, there's like security and like runtime implications of those. So it really is those core ones. When you have a bunch of like just random stuff running, you want to know where it came from better.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe even further, it's things that are generated from our controllers versus things that are directly created with our API shim. Might be a way to look at it.
But there'll be a feature request for Arena as well. This will be a first in a while.
All right. Well then. Not seeing more topics being added. So I might at this point actually let everyone go, give you the 20 minutes back. And we'll see y'all in about 2 weeks or whoever can make it. And hopefully we'll have some more room and all of the stuff.
Thank you, folks, for
Thanks,
sharing some
everyone.
insight into this. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
absolutely. Come back.
Okay.